I'm now going to tell you about how and why I converted from Judaism to atheism, and the best thing I could tell you, or the best way to explain this, is the history of how I was taught to be Jewish and then how I figured out that it's all a bizarre waste of time. So first I'll start off with my parents. They're not from very religious families, but all my direct ancestors, traced as far back as I can trace, are all Jewish. They're all from Eastern Europe, and the term Ashkenazic is sometimes used to refer to the ethnic group in Eastern Europe that historically followed the Jewish religion and spoke a secular language called Yiddish. And my father was not from a very religious family at all, and my mother was maybe very slightly more religious because she went to a conservative synagogue starting when she was 16. She went to a Hebrew school before. My parents did nothing until I was 5 years old, and then they sent me to a Hebrew school, a conservative synagogue, and they went to services at the synagogue sometimes. And conservative is supposed to be somewhat intermediate between Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism. And when I was 12, I got the idea that I should follow Orthodox Judaism, and I got the idea that Orthodox Jews were doing everything you're supposed to do, conservative Jews were doing less, and Reform Jews were doing even less. And it seems like my parents think that Orthodox Judaism is ideal, but unrealistic and not practical. And they used to always go to restaurants on Friday night, but the Jewish Sabbath is Friday night to Saturday night. And then my aunt converted to Orthodoxy, and we started to sometimes go to my aunt's house on Friday night for the Jewish Sabbath rituals, and we started doing some of that in our home, and then we started going to restaurants on Saturday night. When I was 15, one day I came home from school and there was a lamp in my bedroom, and I was very astonished and completely shocked, and I was amazed and thought God had provided the lamp. But then later that day I found out that my mother provided the lamp, and I realized that God didn't exist that day, but somehow I still had guilt or fear about being non-observant. So from the time I was 12 to the time I was 15, I had this idea that I had to follow Orthodox Judaism. I put on tefillin secretly, and I didn't do all the stuff that I thought I was supposed to do because I didn't want anyone to think it was crazy. I knew that my family would think I was nuts if I did it, although I wasn't bold and confident enough to actually admit that I thought I should follow Orthodox Judaism. And I didn't even know all the stuff that Orthodox Jews did. I didn't know about the family purity laws. I didn't know about the so-called shomanagia business where young women can't touch guys, and there's a whole bunch of other mishigash or craziness that I didn't know about. All I knew about was that Orthodox Jews don't drive on Shabbos or the Jewish Sabbath. They don't use electricity, and they don't do a whole bunch of other stuff. And I knew a little bit about the holidays, and that's all I knew. And from the time I was 15 to the time I was 19, I sort of relapsed a little bit into religion again, and I didn't do most of the stuff I thought I was supposed to do because I didn't want anyone to think it was crazy. But sometimes I still went to Orthodox services so that other people there would maybe accept me as one of them and think I'm a good person. And when I was 19, one time I was at a service at Hillel, that's a Jewish college organization, and they were doing a service, and I just stared at the wall and realized that it's all a bizarre waste of time. And then from that time, I kept having increasing thoughts about that it's bizarre, that Judaism is a weird waste of time, and yet I still had this idea that you were supposed to just do all this Jewish stuff. And at one point I thought that if your ancestors spoke a certain language, you had to speak the certain language. And if your ancestors used to dance around the fire and sacrifice a pig to a certain god, then you have to dance around the fire and sacrifice a pig to a certain god. So I just thought that you had to continue on everything your ancestors did. Maybe that reflects this emphasis on traditions in Judaism. And there was one point when, if you would ask me why I thought I had to follow Orthodox Judaism, I would have said, I don't know, and there's no real reason, but it just feels like it's necessary to do. And even as late as 2009, I had a phone interview with a call center, and it sounded promising, and I don't know whether I would have gotten the job, except that I said I couldn't work on Saturday because that's the Jewish Sabbath, and I knew darn well that it wasn't necessary to not work on Shabbos, and I knew I was putting on the pretense that I was observant because I was afraid other Orthodox Jews might somehow figure out that I was non-observant, and I was still afraid to admit that I was non-observant, even though my family's not even observant. They drive and do all kinds of stuff on Shabbos, except that sometimes they'll go to service. My mother works every other weekend, and in 2006, I know I went to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I was going to graduate school away from home, so I went to Chabad for the service, but even though I thought it was silly, and yet I thought that I somehow felt this urge or obligation to go. It's like decent, respectable people go to service and they don't ask questions about it. And in 2007, I went to service, but at Chabad again, but I stole an apple during Yom Kippur, during the break between the morning and afternoon services, and I walked a certain number of blocks away from the synagogue, and I ate the apple where I thought no other Jews would see me. On Yom Kippur, it's the so-called Day of Judgment, and the so-called holiest day of the Jewish year, and when you're not supposed to eat. 2008, I went to Rosh Hashanah, but I conspicuously read a book because I was afraid to not go to Rosh Hashanah, but I knew it was such a weird waste of time. But I skipped Yom Kippur, and it was pretty scary, but I hid in my apartment for the whole day, and I didn't tell my parents I skipped it. 2009, I skipped both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I lied, and I told my parents that I was going to services. They offered to give me money to join the synagogue, and they said, well, I'll pay later, and I can get a ticket first without paying, even though I'm supposed to really pay for the ticket. And then 3 weeks after I lied, I finally came out as a full atheist, and my parents were mortified. They're still mortified that any time I mention my atheism and how I think Judaism is a bizarre waste of time, but they generally don't talk about it unless I mention the subject first. And in another video, maybe I'll explain why rituals are bizarre time wasting, obsessive compulsive behaviors that I don't do and you shouldn't do either, and how God is totally imaginary and prayer is a bizarre waste of time.